Hello and welcome to the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm your host, Nate Goss. It's October, the leaves are falling, the air is brisk, and folks everywhere are voluntarily choosing to be adequately spooked and thoroughly creeped out, which means it is also the perfect time for some horror book picks. So today, our in-house horror genre experts, Lindsay and Mark, are on the podcast to provide you with some terrifying horror recommendations. I spoke with Lindsay and Mark earlier, so let's jump over to our conversation about what to read this month for Halloween. All right, Mark, Lindsay, thank you for being on the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Before we jump right into the recommendations that you guys have, I want to talk just a little bit about the horror genre itself. I kind of have a two-part question here. For those listeners who have never really given this genre a try, or who feel maybe apprehensive about even giving it a shot, what is it that each of you personally love about the genre? And follow-up question, do you think that there is something in the genre that could be potentially for everyone?
Personally, I enjoy it. There's a little bit of nostalgia to it because I'm of the age where I grew up with R.L. Stine's Goosebumps books as a kid, transitioned into the Fear Street novels when I was a teenager. And there was just a little bit of that tiny thrill, like small scares, manageable scares at that age. And there's also, I'm a big fantasy fan and kind of science fiction fan. And I feel like horror blends really well with that because there are all these supernatural elements to not all horror stories, but a lot of horror stories. So those are the ones that I tend to gravitate towards anyways. And it's much easier with supernatural scariness to be like, okay, but that's not real. But you still get that little thrill, that little excitement with the horror stories. There's a horror story for almost everybody. Not everybody's going to like zombie stories. Not everybody's going to like haunted house stories. A lot of the ones I recommend here today are actually more kind of like almost domestic dramas with a haunted house as the backdrop, amplifying that tense relationship within the family.
Mark, anything you want to add to that?
So like Lindsay, I started with horror probably way too young. I have an older brother, and he brought into our house the Alvin Schwartz Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
Love those, yeah. Oh. The illustrations were the best.
Oh, the illustrations were so scary.
Yeah. And so I remember stumbling upon those and being frightened by those really young. But it was also one of the things that really got me reading first. And I think something that is very true of human nature and is true of horror is the fact that we're all trying to deal with forces outside of our control every day in life. And when you read a good horror story, you see these characters come up against forces that are maybe unrealistic or maybe supernatural, but once they overcome them, there's a catharsis to that.
Yeah.
And I think that as readers, we can experience that catharsis through those extreme situations. And
Mark has clearly thought about this much more than I have. I'm like, I just like to be spooked.
I totally like that too.
Answers, I think.
I think that if normal reading can be kind of boring for you, this is the amusement park reading.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It can be. Because there definitely is literary horror, which I love, but there's also the kind of extreme, full throttle horror where you strap in and you're in for the ride.
Yeah. So whether you're looking for that or not, there's something in the genre for you.
Exactly.
Let's go ahead and jump right into our recommendations then, and maybe we'll just kind of, ping pong back and forth. Let's go back to Lindsay here. So what's the first book that you want to recommend?
I actually want to recommend kind of a classic horror story, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson.
Okay.
It was originally published in 1959. I've been a horror fan for a while. I only read it maybe a year or two ago. I think I read it in one sitting. It just had me from the very...
Yeah, well, that's a big selling
from
point.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
It's actually a story that Stephen King says is one of the best horror stories of the 20th century. And many would consider Stephen King one of the best horror authors of the 20th century.
We all know who Stephen King is.
We all know who Stephen King is, yes. The summary of the story is a group of people are brought to this house. A professor wants to study that house to see if there's any kind of supernatural activity there, to get some scientific evidence for supernatural activity. And then lo and behold, supernatural stuff happens. Unexplainable things happen. But the main protagonist through whom you experience everything, starts experiencing things that others in the house don't. And so then you start wondering, okay, how much of this is kind of in her mind? How much of this is the house being an actual entity itself, an evil entity itself? It really creeped me out. It's a very good psychological horror story. You're not looking for, anything gory, but it's very creepy, and I think it will stick with anybody who reads it for quite a while.
All right, so Haunting of Hill House. Now we move on to Mark. What's your first pick for us?
My first pick is Blood Sugar by Daniel Kraus, and people may know Daniel Kraus from his most recent novel, The Shape of Water, which is probably his most critically acclaimed book out
the
right
one
now.
that the movie was made off, that won Best Picture. But this is called, you said Blood Sugar?
This one is Blood Sugar.
Okay.
And Daniel Kraus was originally a young adult author, and he started to transition into some more adult works. This one kind of takes an interesting concept. It takes a look at the old superstition or folk tale that we all know of, what if someone tainted or put objects into Halloween candy?
Oh, okay.
And why would someone do that? So it kind of looks at the social and psychological situations of what would take for a normal person to decide, this Halloween, I'm going to taint this candy. This Halloween, I'm going to get back at my community. What's interesting is that despite that kind of awful situation, through his characters, he still manages to touch on themes of family loyalty, community. It's unexpectedly funny, and it's also tragically beautiful. His characters are relatable and also sympathetic, if that makes sense, even though they're doing this awful thing.
Right. So you're kind of in the mind of them in this book, of the people who are tainting this candy?
So it's told from the perspective of Jody, who's really an interesting character. He has gone through some awful stuff in his life, and he's looking for family any way he can get it. And so he clings on to this adult character, this young adult character who's probably in his 20s, maybe early 30s, who has kind of become an outcast. And he decides that he's going to get back at society.
Okay.
And despite that awful situation, they still manage to form kind of like a family unit. You might read the synopsis on the back and not realize the themes that it touches on.
Sure.
You're just like, why would I want to read a story about a guy who has a break with reality and goes insane and decides to taint candy for children? Why would I want to read this? And Kraus shows you why.
Yeah, there's lots there, it sounds like. So, and this is a more recent book, right?
This like literally just came out. I think,
okay, wow.
Weeks ago.
Oh, just in time for Halloween.
Yep,
Yeah.
Just in time for Halloween.
Great pick, Mark. All right, Lindsay, what's your number 2 pick?
For my second pick, I'm actually going with kind of another classic horror story.
All right.
Because it was my first introduction to one of the masters of horror, Stephen King. So I first read The Shining a handful of years ago. It's not a small novel. It's
not.
It's a nice hefty book. But it really showed me what horror could be. It was much more than, the Fear Street novels that I was just reading as a teen. The hotel, the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, it's also kind of its own character. But it's really just a setting, and it brings out the fact that Jack, the protagonist, the father of this family, with his wife and his young child, it's about their dynamic. It's about the family's dynamic, and about Jack trying to be a good father and failing at times because he's an alcoholic, in part because he's a human being. And then you have this supernatural entity that kind of hones in on that and tries to use Jack's weaknesses against him in order to get at the son. The Shining refers to the son's kind of psychic abilities, his abilities to communicate with others who have the shining. And it took me by surprise. I was surprised at how emotional I felt while reading that book.
So had you seen, which I understand is very different,
yes,
the movie? Had you seen it already before you read the book? Have you even seen the movie?
I have.
Okay.
I had seen The Shining before I read the novel. I understand that Stephen King is not a fan of Kubrick's version.
I had heard the same thing.
And I could see why. They both feel very different versions of horror. Kubrick's film is so visual. Mm-hmm. That aspect of it is not in the novel. And the Jack in this novel is not Jack Nicholson. Just couldn't be Jack Nicholson.
Different character altogether.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Lindsay. Mark, what's your second pick?
So I'm going to keep it in the family. I'm going to go with Joe Hill's newest book of short stories. And for those who don't know by now, I don't know if there are many, but Joe Hill is Stephen King's, I believe, his oldest son, and he writes under a pen name. He started that way so that he could break into the horror genre without riding his dad's coattails. And a brief sampling of the type of tales that you can experience reading this book is you can experience a possessed carnival ride, commuting werewolves, a twisted take on the Chronicles of Narnia, a bird's-eye view of World War III, and a time-traveling bookmobile.
Time-traveling bookmobile?
That sounds perfect.
So there's a little bit of, we talked about earlier the different types of horror. There's a little bit of horror for everyone in this one.
Yeah. And I really like that you recommended a short story collection, because it seems like that might be a great way for someone to explore if they don't know what kind of horror they are into. Very quickly get through a couple different stories.
Absolutely. And if you kind of want that full throttle, to use the title, experience of a short story, then I'd suggest In the Tall Grass, which is also on this collection. And that recently was just adapted into a Netflix movie. And this one is kind of extreme. It's graphic, it's scary.
Yeah.
It's actually written with his dad, Stephen King. They worked on it together. So there's a little bit of horror for everyone in this collection.
Great. All right, let's do one more then. Let's do one last round of horror book picks. Lindsay, what's going to be your last selection for today?
So my last section is actually, it is also a collection of short stories, but it is a graphic novel. It is called Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. Came out in 2014. It was actually an Abraham Lincoln nominee for young adults. It is a collection of 5 short stories. They're all told in comic format. None of these are funny. So these are kind of like modern day fairy tales, and not the Disney version of fairy tales. Not something you're going to tell your 5-year-old to put them to sleep, unless you want to give them nightmares.
No, we don't want that.
No, thank you. So it's like the original Grimm's fairy tales, the original Hans Christian Andersen stories. Where you have Cinderella's stepsisters cutting off their toes to fit into the glass slipper. The language in the stories is almost sparse, because so much is told through the illustrations. They're very simple, kind of clean illustrations, and I think Carol does a very good job of getting across the creepiness and getting across the horror of these stories without just blah.
Yeah, now is Carol the illustrator and author here?
Yes, she is. And actually in this collection, one of the stories is called Face All Red, and it was previously published on her website as a short story. So you could actually check it out on her website still.
Yeah.
To kind of get a feel for if graphic novels are a way you would like to consume horror stories.
We can even put a link to that in our show notes so people
Absolutely.
can check out the website.
Yeah. That was my first introduction to Emily Carroll.
Okay.
I think it's a good introduction to graphic novels, horror graphic novels. You get a real feel for kind of what that extra visual stimulation does for how creepy you find a story.
Well, thanks, Lindsay. And Mark, how about your last pick?
So my last pick is The Invited, which is a novel by Jennifer McMahon. And this story takes place it follows a high school teacher who just lost her father. Not to be morbid, I'm going back to another story with parental loss. But and she decides that with the inheritance, she's going to use this as an opportunity to change her life. And with her husband, she decides to move to Vermont and build their dream house and live a life that they didn't think was necessarily open to them in the past. She decides that while she's building this dream house, she's going to incorporate local history. And the plot of land that they end up buying to build their house on, it turns out, as she's researching, was actually the site where a local witch was killed.
Oh, okay.
So this intrigues her, and she starts almost obsessively researching this witch and researching the family. And as she's building her house, she incorporates pieces of the local history into the house. So she'll buy like the main beam from the house that was part of a schoolhouse that burned down that was connected to the witch. Or I think the mantle that they put on the fireplace was from the tree that the witch was hung on.
So she's pretty much literally inviting.
Literally inviting. All I can think is,
the invited.
What are you doing? No, stop.
What I found interesting about this book is that in other horror haunted house stories, people move into a house by accident, and then they start to experience the hauntings. But in this one, this character is literally building her own haunted house.
Wow,
Based on
it's a really interesting twist.
Yeah, based on her own obsessions and interests.
This was another one that's really recent, right?
Yeah, this one was earlier this year.
Okay, so this
year. I
year.
don't remember the exact.
I wanted to read this. This is on my to-read list.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that sounds great. All right. Well, thank you guys for your book picks. Before we go, I know, Mark, you had actually put together a short list of authors that people might want to check out. Who are some authors that might be worth checking out?
I highly recommend Josh Malerman from Bird Box fame, Grady Hendrix, who just put out a great book called We Sold Our Souls, which it blends metal and horror.
Okay. So metal is in the music genre? Or
Nice.
okay.
Heavy metal.
Yeah.
So what's not to love there?
Yeah.
And then Lauren Bukes, Paul Tremblay, Amy Lukiewicz, and Riley Sager. And the awesome thing about Riley Sager is that if you think that horror might not be for you, but you like thrillers, he's a good kind of gateway into horror. Because a lot of his books are definitely more thrillers in nature, but you can tell that he knows his horror and he loves his horror, and he sets a lot of his books in horror settings. So one will take place at like a summer camp, and the other will take place at a creepy hotel. So that might be a good step in the door to the horror genre if you're not ready for the full thing.
All right. Well, thanks. I think that you guys definitely gave our listeners some things that they should be able to find at least one title or a couple titles, hopefully, that they can find to give them the right chills this month. So, Lindsay, Mark, I just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
Okay, so now that you have a few scary story ideas to give you that perfect Halloween trick and or treat, we want to help get those books in your hands. So check out this episode's show notes for direct links to the books in the library's catalog, or just head over to the catalog yourself at www.cooklib.org. While you're on our website, check out the library's blog, Shelf Life. That's where our librarians post weekly book recommendations along with local history stories, genealogy tips, and a whole lot more. You can visit that blog directly at shelflife.cooklib.org. If you ever want to get in touch with us, leave us some feedback, maybe recommend some show ideas, you can always reach us anytime. You can talk to us on Twitter at Cook Library or send an email to webmaster@cooklib.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word by sharing it with others and let them know they can catch future episodes by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or anywhere they like to get their podcasts. We will be back soon, but until then, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.